from the US. Good afternoon for those in Europe, and good evening for those of you joining us from Asia. So we're very happy to welcome Kristin Blancke today, as well as Etienne Bock. Probably most of you obviously have read what the talk will be about today, since you decided to join. And I think I can say with some confidence that we have two of the Milarepa experts in the world with us today. So it's really an honor. And Kristin did an incredible lifelong work on Milarepa. Maybe some of you had time to look at the book and the link. I'll put it up in the chat again. But she's worked on a sort of 600 plus page book about the literary traditions of Milarepa and how it evolved. And anyway, she'll tell us more about it. No point me telling you. And Etienne works at the Tibet Museum in Switzerland, Gruyere, which has some truly incredible art. I've seen the website. I've never been there. I hope to go one day. And I think they have paintings of the 10th Karmapa in the collection, which are really quite something, and I'm sure many more things. So I won't say much more. We have the usual format. The talk will last an hour, give or take, and then we can have some questions, which you're welcome to write in the chat or just to keep them till the end. And thank you so much for being here today, all of you, and thank you and welcome.
Oh, Jamien. Hello, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here with after the invitation of Jamyang to briefly introduce my book In Search of Mila's Collected Songs. Sorry, I see I have not started this presentation yet. Okay, now it should be better, no? Okay, as most of you will know, Milarepa was a yogi who lived between the the 11th and the 12th century, 1040 till 1123. He was one of the forefathers of the Kagyu lineages, famous for his ascetic lifestyle through which he obtained what is called liberation in one lifetime, and famous for his beautiful spiritual songs called Gur in Tibetan. Milarepa is known to us through Tsangnyon Heruka's Life and Songs of Milarepa, which includes both the life of Milarepa and the 100,000 songs of Milarepa, and was written and published in 1488, approximately 350 years after Milarepa's life. The book I wrote is a comparative study of Tibetan texts narrating Milarepa's life and songs found between the 12th and the 15th centuries. Today, I intend to talk about the conclusions we can draw from such a comparative study. As you will see, it allows us to read Tsangnyon Heruka's work, keeping in mind the changes in narrative that had developed throughout the centuries. So Tsangnon's book is both the starting point and the ending point of my exploration. My interest in studying about Milarepa started in the early 80s when my husband, Franco Pizzi, and I were residing at Palpung Sherabling, Taisitpas Monastery in Himachal Pradesh, India. We had bought two copies of Tsangnyon Heruka's Life and Songs of Milarepa from Manali, and we had put these on a small shrine in the little house in the middle of the forest where we were staying. Our friend Karma Dorje, a monk, came to visit us every night, and he asked us, "Why did you buy these books and put them on your shrine? You should read them at least." So we started doing just that, and we started thinking it would be good to translate the 100,000 songs into Italian. And so one evening after the other, we would study 1 page or 2 pages. And when we had some pages ready, we would go up to meet Sarji Rinpoche, who was at that time staying at Cherabling Monastery. And he would go through what we had done before and indicate and resolve all the problems we had with the text. Then, after Sarji Rinpoche passed away, we were further helped with the, at that time, very young Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche. And so eventually, in 1989, we managed to publish our first book, selecting those stories and songs that most appealed to us. We then engaged in a complete translation of the songs, of which one volume has been published in 2002, and hopefully the rest of the book will be published this year. In the meantime, several studies had appeared around the narratives of Milarepa, such as Francis Tizo's work on the Gyaltampa life story of Milarepa, and Peter Allen Roberts' work on the biographies of Rechungpa, and later also Andrew Quintman's work on the textual tradition of Milarepa. As these studies gave rise to some questioning about the authenticity of Tsangnyon Heruka's way of presenting Milarepa and his students, I decided to research as many life and song stories as possible and compare them with the equivalent ones in Tsangnyon's work. So I collected all the available texts I could find, and as an instrument, I made song charts from each of the text, putting in the outline and the page numbers where each song can be found in each of these texts, so that it became easy to compare the contexts and the songs with each other and with Tsangnyon Heruka. So here I will very briefly survey the studied text, then I will point out the differences in Tsangyon's work and the evolution of some doctrinal aspects that have become reflected in the biographies. Milarepa himself did not write anything. The first witnesses about his life and songs are found in the Golden Rosaries, which is a literary genre of texts including short biographies of the successive masters of the particular lineage to which the compiler of the text was devoted. I divided the biographies into 3 strands corresponding to Milarepa's main disciples, Ngenzon Tempa, Rechungpa Drakpa, and Gampopa Sonam Rinchen. It was interesting to find out that in each of these 3 strands, the principal disciple of Milarepa, and so the one who upholds his teachings, is considered to be the founding of the lineage to which the compiler refers. The 3 strands are differentiated in their structure and in the songs they include. If you are interested to see what these early Golden Rosary texts looked like, I recommend to read the 12th century life story of Milarepa by Ngenzon Tumpa and Gun and Kung Repa, titled The Complete Liberation of Mila Vajra Victory Banner. It is subdivided into 20 chapters, each corresponding to one quality developed by Milarepa on his journey to complete liberation, and it includes several short songs. There are only few stories, and each quality starts with a brief narrative frame, followed by one or more songs. The next evolution, which is very important in the Milarepa literature, is started at more or less the first half of the 13th century, because at that time a series of voluminous works were created dedicated exclusively to Milarepa, so not the other teachers. Andrew Quintman called these texts biographical compendia, whereas my colleague Etienne and I opted for the name Dorje Compendia because the colophons of all these compendia systematically refer to the Jetsun with his secret name Milarepa Dorje, the laughing Vajra, given to him at the time of his initiation. In academic circles, this first compendium is known as the 12 great disciples, Puchen Chunye. Nevertheless, the colophon states that this life of Milarepa was written down for the benefit of worthy meditators by, or in the words of, the 12 great Repa sons, such as Ngenzon Tempa Bodhiratza and the others. Therefore, it seems more adequate to refer to the work as the 12 great Repa disciples, indicating the cotton-clad yogi disciples of Milarepa and not the monk disciples. The author of this text is unknown. From my analysis, the attribution to Milarepa's Repa sons does not seem reliable. It has to be a little later. The work incorporates different episodes from the life stories in all three lineage strands cited above. It follows the same subdivision into qualities as the life stories in Rechumpa's lineage, and therefore we may assume that it has been originated in the context of that lineage. It consists of several narrative cycles called Kor, stories narrating the encounters between Mila and his disciples, patrons, devotees, demons, and spirits in a way very similar but more fragmentary as they would be narrated later by Tsangnyon Heruka. We have several witnesses of this work, but none predates the 15th century. However, we do have some indications of its earlier composition, such as a slightly variant version said to have been compiled by under the auspices of the third Karmapa Ranjun Dorje between 1284 and 1339, after he had surveyed 100 different versions of lives and songs of Milarepa. Now, the importance of the 12 great Repa disciples lies in the fact that it is the first work in which a Dakini appears to make a prophecy to Milarepa, saying that Gampopa will be his son similar to the sun, and Rechungpa his son similar to the moon. With this prophecy, the preeminence of Gampopa over Rechungpa was legitimized. This constitutes a very important shift in the narrative of how the Kagyu lineages have evolved, whereas earlier the founder of a lineage was considered as Mila's main successor. From now on, the real heir becomes Gampopa. To understand this, we could consider that at the time of the text's origin, Rechumpa's lineage, which was a tradition of lay person yogis, had already become part of the Drukpa Kagyu lineage, founded by Lingrepa and Sampagyare, and these two founders were both disciples of Rechungpa as well as of Pamodrukpa, who was himself a disciple of Gampopa. But then in the Drukpa lineage, it was Gampopa who was considered as the most important among the Jetsun's disciples, and thus Rechungpa was put in a secondary place. This first work was supposedly kept secret and transmitted only to a very restricted number of practicing yogis. Around the end of the 15th or the beginning of the 16th century, several new compendia appeared, forming a second stratum Dorje compendia. These were all based on the slightly variant version attributed to Karmapa Ranjun Dorje. Compared to the earlier versions, there are new narrative cycles and new songs included in these compendia, which have become really very big. Two of these compendia are actually available in London. The Oxford Bodleian Library has a witness of the 12 great Repa disciples, and the British Library has a second straight-tome manuscript of which you can see a sample page on the slide. Another witness of the 12 great Repa disciples is the Bourdieu manuscript that Etienne Bock will briefly introduce. Finally, there is yet another group of Milarepa biographies connected to the second Shamar Kachewompo, who lived in the 14th century. His life story of Milarepa was further elaborated in at least two more Golden Rosary stories and became the basis for the life in Tsangnyon Heruka's work. So, in a nutshell, these are all the works Tsangnyon Heruka had at his disposal when he composed his Life and Songs of Milarepa, besides oral sources and stories being told in the context of pilgrimages to Buddhist sites. He based his life stories mainly on the narratives coming from Gampopa's lineage, and that is to say, Gyaltampa's life story and Kachewompo's life story. On the slide, besides the two main English translations by Lobsang Lalumpa and by Andrew Quintman, I also want to mention a new version of Vita di Milarepa by Carla Gianotti for our Italian audience. It has just been published earlier this month. Then, for his 100,000 songs, his 100,000 songs were mainly based on the 12 great Repa disciples. So he skillfully wove together elements from the various traditions and created a new narrative with a very engaging novel-like storyline written with great literary talent. You can see here the two main English translations of the 100,000 songs, the one by Garma Chichi Chang and the one by Christopher Stark. On the next slide, I mentioned several studies about Tsangnyon Heruka, about the reasons and the way he composed his text and distributed it in the form of wood block prints so that it could reach a wide public, and also a few studies that talk about his literary talent. Because of this, his work became the most famous example of literature in the Tibetan culture. Now, I want to briefly explain what makes the difference between his 100,000 songs and the preceding text as far as the content is concerned. And for this, I will examine four topics. First of all, the importance of Rechung and Gampopa in Mila's lineage. Then the relationship between Bön and Buddhism in the biographies and between the Kadampa teachers and Milarepa, and then Tsangnon's attitude towards women. So the first topic, Mila, Rechung and Gampopa. As per the tradition of his time, Tsangnon considered Gampopa as Mila's principal disciple. Already in the 12 great Repa disciples, Rechungpa had been presented as a rebellious and proud disciple by adding a few stories and episodes in which he was presented in not such a very bright manner. By contrast, this image was absent from the earlier Golden Rosaries, where he was instead considered a great master. From Rechumpa's biographies, we know that the Jetsun had entrusted to Rechungpa his most important doctrinal teaching, the oral transmission of Samvara or Demcho Nyingyu, and that Rechungpa himself had originated a lineage of tantric teachings called the oral transmission of Rechungpa or Rechung Nyingyu. This entrustment is not mentioned neither in the 12 great Repa disciples nor by Tsangnyon Heruka. Instead, Tsangnyon further accentuated Rechumpa's inferior position emphasizing his grumpy character even more strongly than was the case in the 12 great Repa disciples. To reach this goal, he mixed and moved some of the earlier stories in a different context. In some cases, a song addressed to Rechungpa in the 12 great Repa disciples was now addressed to Gampopa. Another important song, first addressed to Rechungpa, was now delivered to 5 young nuns, as we will see later. This topic of Rechumpa's depreciation has been analyzed in great detail by Peter Allen Roberts. As an example of the new episodes inserted in the compendia that diminished Rechumpa's importance, on the next 3 slides, I missed one. Yes. On the next 3 slides, you can see images from the Kyang episode. First, according to the narrative of the 12 great Repa disciples, and then in Tsangnyon songs. In the same way as the episode of the yak horn, also this episode appeared for the first time in the 12 great Repa disciples. For those who are not familiar with it, Rechungpa had gone to India to retrieve some text recommended by Mila from the disciples of Naropa, but he also brought back some text on black magic and scholasticism that he wanted in order to be able to defeat scholarly teachers. Upon his return, Mila noticed that Rechungpa had become proud for what he had been able to accumulate, and that he had to overcome this pride, Mila tested him by exhibiting miracles to show him that he should cut his pride. One of these testing episodes is the following. He sent Rechungpa to fetch water, as you here you cannot see it. He sent him to fetch water, and in the meantime, Mila burned this you can see here, burned the unwanted, the by him unwanted texts that Rechungpa had brought back. On his way, Rechungpa is here on the right side, and he saw a very nice scene in which 7 wild asses, 1 mother and 6 foals, and 7 wolves, a mother and 6 young, were all playing together. And then Rechungpa made the consideration to himself that the mothers would soon teach their young ones that the youngs would learn to flee from the wolves, and the wolves would learn to chase them as a result of their imprints. Then Rechungpa returned to Mila to discover that his texts were burned. He was very upset about this, and he did not let himself being impressed when Mila showed him different miracles, so as to put up a show that was even more impressive than that of the Kyangs. At last, as Rechungpa does not pay attention to Mila, Mila flies away in the sky, and then Rechungpa realizes that without his teacher he cannot go anywhere, and that he has been too proud, and then he repents. Now, I choose this episode because Tsangnyon describes the scene differently. Here, one Kyang mother gives birth to 1 female foal, and each of them again gives birth to another foal, and so on, until the whole plain is filled with 100 Kyangs. You can see the Kyangs in the upper row give birth to the small ones. And so we have 100 Kyangs, and then at the end, one of the Kyangs transforms into a wolf, which you see here on the left-hand side, and that wolf will chase all the Kyangs over the mountain. Thus, in Tsangnon's case, we find this extra miracle scene created by Mila, which was absent in the previous text. And this makes the situation even more spectacular and enhances once more the rebellious character of Rechungpa. Now, the second topic I want to treat is the attitude towards Bon and Buddhism in the Milarepa biographies. Although it is quite likely that Milarepa grew up in a Bon family, and although he had received Bon as well as Dzogchen teachings, over time there appears a negative picturing of the Bon tradition that was absent in the earlier texts. The literary corpus, in the literary corpus, there are three main episodes treating the Bon Buddhism relationship. As an example, I tell one of them. In the Golden Rosaries, there is an episode where a dying Bonpo, who had secretly been a follower of Milarepa, asks his family to invite Mila at the moment that he is dead to celebrate a funeral ceremony for him. In the Golden Rosaries, the episode is only a few lines long, and there is not the slightest bias between the two traditions. From the 12 great Repa disciples onwards, a slight form of criticism against the Bon tradition emerges by the dying person himself explaining why he thought Buddhist Dharma had to offer more means for obtaining liberation at the moment of death. By contrast, in Kachubompo's life story, there is an open competition during the funeral ceremony. On the ground floor of the building where the rites are going on, the Bonpos also perform a ritual in which they invite the deceased person who comes to partake of the offerings. Upon hearing this, Milarepa, who is celebrating his ritual on the upper floor, sends Jiwaeu to confront that being, and it runs away, admitting that it is not the deceased person, but a local demon. So at that point, the Bumpos all become convinced that the power of Mila is greater than that of Bun. Tsangnyon follows Kachowompo's version, but he adds one more detail that is not found anywhere else. At a certain point, the Jetsun says that the deceased person has now taken a rebirth as a worm under a mound of dry dung, and that he is going to liberate it, and all the Bumpos accompany him to see how he liberates that worm from this life and obtains liberation. In this case, we see how Tsangnyon clearly ridicules the Bun doctrine. Another Bumpo chapter is the Narubanchung story on which Etienne will elaborate. Here, Mila appears as extremely arrogant towards the Bumpos. From these examples, it seems that in the earlier writings there was no antagonism between the two traditions, whereas it had escalated in the writings of the later times. Now, my third topic regards Mila and the monk scholars. In chapter 34 of Tsangnyon Songs, we find the title Winning the Debate Arisen Through Jealousy with Power and Magic. This chapter narrates that the monk scholars from a nearby monastery are jealous because the Jetsun receives all the offerings from the villagers. To teach him a lesson and disgrace him in front of the other people, they engage in a debate with Mila, thinking that he would be no match for them as he was not well versed in the technicalities of dialectics, and that because of this defeat, he would have to leave. Whereas this episode is short in the Golden Rosaries, in the Compendia it becomes very elaborate with many songs. The result is that the monks obtain faith in the Jetsun and become teacher meditators, in Tibetan called Tön Gom. Now, Tsangnyon Heruka uses the same songs found in the 12 great Repa disciples, but he introduces a few significant innovations adding 2 episodes in prose in which Mila wins a contest in dialectics by resorting to miracles and clairvoyance. Then follows a third miracle, a sign of the Jetsons' clairvoyance. That evening, while he was at home, Lotan, one of the monk scholars, poured the blood into the Buddha's begging bowl instead of milk, and he filled the kapala with milk instead of blood, and he turned the pictures of the Buddha upside down and on his shrine. He turned them upside down. And then he thought, if Milarepa will know about this, then I can be sure that he genuinely has the higher perceptions and can perform miracles. Then the next morning, the Jetsun tells him he should not do such things, which was proof of his clairvoyance, and Lotan became faithful and became a disciple of Milarepa. Darlo, instead, the other scholar, did not believe in him, and because of his wrong views, he died and took a rebirth as a fierce demon. This is the way that Tsangnyon Heruka tells this story. In Tsangnon's work, there are 3 more episodes about monk scholars that do not appear in any of the previous works. So, by devoting 4 consecutive chapters to monk scholars, Tsangnyon Heruka appears to be making a profound statement about the scholarly approach to Dharma. He demonstrates his understanding of the terminology and the functioning of debate, while also highlighting the supremacy of meditative experience over knowledge acquired through scriptures and logic. This could suggest that Sanyong aims to defend the Dakpo Kagyu against the criticism by Sakyapandita and his followers regarding the doctrinal innovations introduced by Gampopa and his followers. Now, the fourth topic is Mila's attitude towards women. In all the biographies of Milarepa, also in the very early ones, there are various explicit statements of the disadvantages for women along the spiritual path, considered because women were considered of inferior birth because of their social role and psychophysical condition. Starting from the 12 great Repa disciples, we find stories of female followers of Milarepa eventually becoming great meditators and yoginis, whereas in the Golden Rosaries, except for the 5 Tseringma goddesses, no such written stories of realized women were found. So we could wonder whether these were transmitted orally or newly invented. Anyway, Tsangnyon Heruka accentuates this trope with every female disciple we meet. For instance, in his chapter about meeting Paldarbum, he adds 2 extra songs narrating the disadvantages of the female condition. And he does the same in case of the chapter on meeting Rechungpa, which you see here in on the slide, and in his chapter 37 about Saleh E. Moreover, as already mentioned when talking about Tsangyon's depreciation of Rechungpa, in the chapter titled The Yolmo Snowy Mountain Ridge, 5 young nuns come to meet him, and Milarepa offers a song to them in which he encourages the novice nuns to abandon worldly life and become self-sufficient. In the Compendia, this song was addressed to Rechungpa during his first meeting with Milarepa. By substituting Rechungpa with 5 young nuns, Tsangnyon obtains a double effect. He diminishes Rechungpa's importance, which is in line with the point already made before, and he accentuates his rationale in favor of women, telling them to become self-sufficient, which is quite a strong statement in the 15th century Tibet. Even though Tsangnyon Heruka accentuates the women's difficulties in becoming serious practitioners, this does not necessarily make him more of a male chauvinist than the other authors of the other texts. It might be his own expedient to accentuate the capacities of women who, although starting from a more disadvantaged starting point, eventually attain enlightenment. From previous studies, it seems that in the communities of lay practitioners of the 11th and 12th centuries, the female followers of a charismatic teacher who transmitted tantric practices had more freedom than their 15th century sisters who lived in a time when religious orders had established monasteries led by exclusively male clergy. From this point of view, we could even think that Tsangnyon Heruka takes a stand in favor of women, encouraging them to take part once again in the religious context and go back to make mountain retreats and meditate to reach realization. So far, I have given a few examples of how Tsangnyon adjusted his narrative by manipulating existing stories and using existing songs in different contexts. I now want to draw your attention to another very important point, and that is how the biographies became an instrument for propagating new doctrinal elements that had emerged over time. The biographies of Rechungpa and Ngenzon Tumpa's lineage leave no doubt to the fact that Mila was essentially a tantric practitioner who relied on the typical methods of secret mantra, Sangak in Tibetan, in particular on the cycles of the Vajra Tantra and the Chakrasamvara Tantra. His main practices were inner heat, Tummo in Tibetan, and the other methods of the so-called yogas. His primary focus was the development of the network of Nadi, Prana, and Bindu that allowed him to transform his mind and reach the complete realization. In the Golden Rosaries, we see references to the elaboration of the doctrinal corpus of oral transmission of samvara, not samsara, instructions transmitted from Vajrayogini to Tilopa, Naropa, Marpa, and Milarepa, and from him to Rechungpa, or, according to others, to Ngenzon Tumpa. Nowadays, this corpus is hardly studied or practiced and is preserved only in the different text collections in Rechungpa and Ngenzon Nyingyu lineages. Then, after Gampopa's time, in the Dakpo Kagyu lineages, the accent on a purely tantric approach gradually shifted in the direction of the typical Mahamudra approach to spiritual development, formulated in terms of ground, path, and result, and of view, meditation, conduct, and fruition. Especially in the biographical compendia and the later life stories up to Tsangnyon Heruka, this evolution emerges in many new songs added to those found in the earliest life stories. So, we can view Milarepa's and his disciples' liberation stories as a window through which we can glance at one side, from one side at the various depictions of the yogi's life, and from the other side as the gradual build-up of doctrinal systems accentuating different aspects of the path to enlightenment related to the lineage in which they were transmitted. In summary, this study indicates that instead of Tsangnon's title, The Collected Songs of Milarepa, it might be more appropriate to rename his work as The Collected Songs Transmitted in the Lineages Coming from Milarepa. Now, I want to end my presentation with a few words about Mila's singing. As a youth, he had learned popular folk songs with a teacher and had become very proficient in these. This is one of the reasons why he was called Tepaga, joyful to hear. Before him, also other teachers had sung spiritual songs called gur, one of whom was Marpa. But Marpa's songs were delivered mainly on the occasion of ritual feasts. He narrated details of his trips to India and Nepal and described which instructions he had received. By contrast, Milarepa's songs erupted spontaneously in whichever circumstance he found himself. To convey his teachings to his listeners in his songs, he relied on his knowledge of the popular songs he had learned as a youth. His songs were inspired by the tradition of Tibetan storytellers, using examples from nature and or aspects of the indigenous Tibetan culture. In this way, his songs had a great appeal for the people. Just how important they were can be understood, seeing that various later authors took the style of his songs as a model for composing their own songs. On the slide, you can see an example of this from Gyalwa Gotrakpa's Hermit of Go Cliff. Thus, Milarepa's songs are an extraordinary witness of the Tibetan culture from the 11th through the 15th centuries. They illustrate the exemplary life of a yogin who finds joy in his solitary life, through which he deepens the knowledge of his own nature obtained through assiduous meditation. Even if the songs do not exactly correspond to the way Mila delivered them, or even if many stories and songs are the fruit of imaginative storytelling or political, religious, and socio-cultural re-elaborations, they remain a demonstration of the impact Jetsun Milarepa has left on the Tibetan culture. We have to thank Tsangnyon Heruka for giving us access to this magical world. So that's it for me. And now I give the word to Etienne.
Thank you, Kristin. Hello, everyone. So, my name is Etienne Bock. Let me share my screen. It will be better like this. Oh, shabash. Oh, yeah. First of all, I want to thank the Shangshung Institute and Jamyong for organizing the conference. Also, Kristin for inviting me to participate to her presentation. So, my name is Etienne Bock. I work at the Tibet Museum Fondation Alain Bordier in Gruyère, Switzerland. I make a short presentation drawn from our common work with Kristin, Showdown at Mount Tissé. So, to briefly give an introduction, in 2017, the museum I work for now acquired a manuscript of the life and song of Mila Shepetoje, presented at the time as one of the earliest version of the Dark Treasury, by Rechungpa. In 21, Mr. Bordier contacted me to participate to the redaction of a book presenting the museum collection using the manuscript as its core. So we, along with two other colleagues, we worked on it. And in October 22, the book Buddhist Art of Tibet in Milarepa's Footsteps was published. The following month, in November, we made a public presentation organized by the Société Française d'Études du Monde Tibétain, a conference named Chapeau Noir et Coton Blanc, so it's black hat and white cotton. On this occasion, I got in contact with Kristin, who asked me questions about the manuscript, the body manuscript. We started exchanging and working. We worked together, and a year and a half later, in March 24, we published a special issue of the Revue d'études tibétaines, New Studies on the Milarepa Compendia. So This special issue was elaborated in concert with Kristin, of course. We extensively used her prolific song charts, which were really useful for comparing the content of the songs in the different version of the compendia and also the narratives. And in the end, we had two articles. Kristin wrote the first one and I wrote the second one, which is titled Groping in the Dark Treasury. And it's basically a reflection on the compendia and the concept of dark treasury, Dzonakma, which is associated to Rangjung Dorje, the third Karmapa. It's an in-depth analysis of the Bordier manuscripts in relation to the other text of the compendia. I also make a comparison of the illuminations, some of which you have seen in Kristin's presentation. I question the attribution to Rangjung Dorje. I also analyzed the problem of coherence between colophons, content, and also the history of transmission. And finally, I made a detailed index of all compendia, including the images legend. So Kristin already talked about the corpus, but briefly, the compendia is the word chosen by Andrew Quintman to describe this type of literature. So it's an assortment or varied collection. The first works to explicitly encompass liberation narrative and song collection. We divided them into two strata. So the early stratum has first the 12 great Repa disciples, the Repa Puchenchuni. As Kristin said, it's the first extensive collection of narrative and songs devoted to Milarepa, and the colophon attributes the text to the 12 most important yogin disciples of Milarepa, such as Rechungpa and the like. And then there is a second category of text, which we name variants, because basically it's the same content, it's the same basis as the Repa Puchenchuni, but with additional content, sometimes not much, but narrative, songs, and sometimes chapters or cycles. And then there is a second stratum, a later one, which gathers the so-called dark treasury or Dzonakma attributed to Rangjung Dorje. This one is much longer than the one from the early stratum, and it has many more songs, chapters, and on top of the colophon, it says the text was compiled by Rangjung Dorje, which is, there were also references to Rangjung Dorje in the variants, but not clearly. One says it was compiled by him, some just mention him. I'll come to this later. But for the Dzonakma, for the Dark Treasury, it says it was compiled by the 12 Great Repa disciples. Then the second colophon says it was compiled by Rangjung Dorje. And then there are many ending prayers and a third colophon, which states the text was edited under the supervision of the fourth Shamar, Choda Yeshe, which brings the text to the end of the 15th century or beginning of the 16th century. The second group is River of Blessings, Chinlap Kichugun. It's the largest of all compendia. It brings together many stories, sometimes many versions of the same story, put one after the other, many more songs, repetitions, and so on. And the colophon here acknowledges the use of multiple sources. It says this text was based on the Dark Treasury by Rangjung Dorje and other texts, and blah blah. And then finally, there is some sort of orphan text, which is the British Library manuscript. This one also differs from the Repa Puchenchuni with different chapters and songs, but unlike the Dark Treasury and the River of Blessings, this one acknowledges the use of multiple sources, but make no mention to neither the Dzonakma nor Rangjung Dorje. Instead, it is connected to the Taglung Kagu. So briefly, the Bordier manuscript, so the title is The Compilation of Jetsun Milarepa Dorje's Collected Songs and Liberation Story. It has 321 folios, the 35th is missing. It's written in Dutsa, in black and red ink, as you can see on the picture. And it has 107 illuminations with Kyukik legends, but I'm almost certain the missing folio had an 108th illumination. And it's a variant version of the 12 Great Repa disciples, and only small differences. 3 additional passages, Gampopa and the Great Torma. Rechungpa is present at Mila's cremation ground, and and an extra song about the bardo. Put together, it's only 2 folio additional compared to the shortest version of the 12 Great Repa disciples. It has 18 qualities or main chapters, whereas all the early stratum texts have 17. And finally, the body manuscript ends with the history of the transmission of the Dark Treasury, which is placed after the regular Jepapuchenchuni colophon. Now, this text tells the story of the compilation of the text of the life and songs of Milarepa during Milarepa's life. The text is said to have been revised by Milarepa himself, and then transmitted secretly through Rechungpa to Dusumkempa and within the Karmakagyu lineage until the disciples of the 6th Karmapa. But unlike the other variants version, the MS Bordier make no reference to Rangjung Dorje whatsoever, no attribution, no mention of him, except he only appears briefly as one of the master in the lineage of transmission of the text, but that's all. So why choosing Naru Bunchung? Of course, as Tucci has said, one of the most important episodes in Milarepa's life. It is the same thing that Ermakov said in his presentation. It's one of the most famous episodes with Milarepa. It's both controversial and polemical, since it's really quite violent against Pumpo and Bön in general. It's absent from most sources, and that's a real problem. It appears exclusively in a few texts under various forms. The most famous version, of course, is that of Tsangnyon in his Gurbum. It's the 22nd chapter, the Taming of Naru Bunchung, which is the longest and the most elaborate version. It belongs to the second cycle of the ripening and liberation of the fortunate heart sons and daughters, which is quite strange since Naru Bunchung never appears as a disciple, at least within Tsangnyen's work. So here are 2 examples, one detailed from a Rubin Museum painting on the left, showing some episodes of the magical duel between Milarepa and Naru Bunchung, and on the right is a painting published by Tony Schmidt in '52, belonging to the Swedish Ethnographic Museum. Now here is a detail from a painting from the Bordier collection, and it shows the episode as presented in Tsangnyon. So briefly, on number 1, you see Milarepa arriving at Tissé. He is greeted by local gods who offer him the site for him and his disciple lineage. On number 2, along with the disciple, he arrives on the shore of Lake Mapam and meets Naru Bunchung. They start talking, and they disagree on whose sacred site it is. And the bonpos said it's bonpo, and Milarepa said no, it's Buddhist. And the bonpos say, okay, we should settle this through a contest of miracles. So on 3a, you see Milarepa sitting on the lake. The text says, with his body, he covers all the surface of the Lake Mapam, which is his first miracle. And then on 3b, he lifts the lake on the tip of his finger. In both cases, it says, without the lake becoming smaller, on Milarepa becoming bigger, which is the same expression as in the yak horn miracle. Then the bonpo says, okay, you win this round, but we should continue. On 4a and 4b, you see they go on circumambulation around the Mount Tissé. Each of them goes in his proper direction, so clockwise for Milarepa and anti-clockwise for the Naru Bunchung. And when they meet, the Naru Bunchung said to Mila, now you should do it in the bonpo way. And Milarepa grabs the hand of the bonpo and starts pulling, leaving his footprints in the rock, and he forces Naru Bunchung to do circumambulation in the Buddhist way. Then on number 5, they make a strength contest by lifting boulders. So Naru Bunchung lifts a huge boulder as big as a yak, and of course Milarepa lifts a boulder twice as big. Then on number 6, Milarepa goes to a western cave and Naru Bunchung to an eastern cave of Tissé, and Mila stretches his leg across the mountain, putting his feet right in the face of the Bonpo, who fails accomplishing the same. And Tsangnyon said the gods laugh at Naru Bunchung, so he's really ridiculized. Then on number 7, they meet again during circumambulation. It starts raining, and they agreed on building a shelter. So Mila say, I take care of the wall, you take care of the roof. The Bonpo takes a huge rock for the roof, and Mila breaks it through his magical powers. Then he says, okay, this was a bit, I was cheating, so I should also take care of the roof. So he takes a large boulder, put it on top, says it's too low, so he goes underneath and lifts it, and leaving his handprints in the ceiling. And then he says it's too high and goes on top and press it down, leaving his footprints. So the Bonpo say, okay, you won all these rounds, but still I'm not convinced, so I should go all in. And let's say on the 15th day, the first one to reach the summit of the Mount Tissé should own the place. And on the morning, the Bonpo starts flying on his drum, which we can see near the number 8. And Milarepa instantly transports to the summit of the mountain. He subjugates the Bonpo, who falls from his drum, luckily not dying. And then the Bonpo finally recognizes the superiority of Milarepa and says, okay, you own the place. Where should I go for practicing burn? And Milarepa throws some snow on a small mountain nearby and say, you should reside there. And when you come to make your circumambulations, you should stay by a stupa, which we don't see on the painting. But the interesting thing is that although subjugated, is not converted. Here is a picture, it's a print screen from a YouTube video showing the inside of the Dutupuk, the miracle cave, which was allegedly built by Naru Bunchung and Milarepa, or Milarepa alone, and it's a natural cave supposed to be an artificial shelter, anyway. So now Naru Bunchung within the compendia. So it's absent from every single compendia of the early stratum. Not a line. It appears exclusively in the latest stratum in 2 texts, except for the British Library manuscripts. So the first one is the so-called Dark Treasury attributed to Rechungpa Dorje, and the chapter is almost identical to the very letter of that of Tsangnyon, which is really strange, and I say suspicious, because since the River of Blessings claimed to be based on the Dark Treasury by Rechungpa Dorje, it should reproduce the same chapter. But as you can see nearby, just after, the River of Blessings version is just few lines without songs. So briefly, drawn from Quintman's translation, an accomplished Bonpo master called Naru Bunchung, who lived there, said this sacred site is a place blessed by the Bonpo teacher Shenrap, and it snows the divine's face of Geke. You yogin don't stay around here. He then laid down a wager on the sites and drew the Jetsun into a contest of miracles, but due to the power of the Mila mastery of miracles display, Naru Bunchung was not able to defeat him and offer the sites to the Jetsun. Now, the chronology of the known Naru Bunchung mentions, the earliest we found so far is in Shicheripa. It was composed at the end of the 14th century. There is a Bonpo guide to Tissé by a master named Yeshi Gelsen, which is probably from the beginning of the 15th century. There is a 2-line mention in a 1448 prayer by Namka Saudrup, a Jigong master. Then Golotsawa mentioned the episode in the Blue Annals in 1478. Then we have the River of Blessing, which is allegedly composed in the 15th century. Then Tsangnyon Heruka with his long version, and according to me, the version was copied in the Dark Treasury edited by the 4th Shamar. So end of the 15th century, beginning of the 16th. Now in Shincheripa, without reading everything, the episode starts at the time when he went to chase the Bonpo from Mount Tissé. The Jetsun was accompanied, blah, 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 blah. And with the battle of miraculous powers, the Bonpo was driven away. The story of stealing Tissé is explained separately. So here, Shichelipa used the expression stealing of Tissé, which is quite negative. And also, he classifies Narubunshung and his sibling as one of Mila's disciples in a group called Turning Misfortune into an Opportunity to Seize the Path. That is, he is the only author known to include Narubunshung as a disciple. Then the small part from the Bonpos Guide to Tissé and Lake Mapam. The great accomplished Narubunshung and Jinsu Milarepa stayed at the Unchanging Miracle Cave, where each of them left his changeless footprint. In the cave where the secret idam is realized, unborn syllables appeared spontaneously. Riding his drum, he flew into the sky, leaving his unchanging seal in the stone. Thus, the qualities are inconceivable. Now, this small passage is devoid of rivalry. There is no contest or no winner or loser. It's just mentioning the fact. Then, in the Blue Annals, Golotsawa first starts the beginning of the life of Milarepa and ends saying, up to this, I had written the life story of Mila in detail because I had seen many spurious accounts. I believe that the above account by myself correspond to the actual facts. According to another account, and then he tells the story. So Mila arrived at Kailash. There was a Bonpo adept who had mounted a drum and was about to proceed to the snowy summit. The Venerable One reached the snowy summit within a single moment, and then having spread his linen garment, which is in fact cotton, not linen, he sent the Bonpo adept down with his drum and showed many other similar miracles. After that, he came down from the summit, and numerous supporters such as Dormo and others attended on him. Now, we have the fourth Shamar Chödra Yishe, which is a roughly contemporary of Tsangnyon, one of the major religious and political figures of the 15th and 16th century. And although he is associated with editing the Dark Treasury attributed to Rangjung Dorje, within his complete works, we have two groups, two prayers to Milarepa and one text on Tissé, dated 1504. And none of these works mention Mila's encounter with the Narubunshung, nor the Tissé magical contest. Although the Tissé text was composed 16 years after Tsangnyeon's version, he says nothing about it, which is quite strange. Then we have a Digung Guide to Tissé and Lake Majopa, really late one, 1896, written by the 34th Order of Digung. And in this guide, translated in English by Huber and Ridzin, some passages, he mentions the place where Mila and Naro has their strength contest, and then he talks about Zutupuk, but then he only quotes from Tsangnyon. And later on in the guide, in a section not translated by Huber and Ridzin, a section called the Digung ownership, basically the Digung story connected to Tissé, there is a brief account on Nyul Hanangpa, 12th and 13th century master, who is said to have stayed at Lanang and Zutupuk. So this would induce the existence of the sites of Zutupuk at the turn of the 13th century. So it should be the earliest testimony about Milarepa miracles at Tissé. However, I looked through two of his geographies, and neither Milarepa, nor the cave appears, which is really strange. So since the guide is a late composition, I'm not really, I don't really trust him. Then when we look at the early Kagyu settlements in the Tissé area seen by the Western scholars, Petek in his 78 Jigungpa sect in Western Tibet and Ladakh says that the Drukpa arrived with good Sampa Gompo Dorje between 1213 and 1217, and for the Jigung, it's Nyul Hanampa, who is said to have found the shrine of Zutupuk, but I think here Petek mistranslated the passage from the Tissé guide mentioned earlier. And Vitali says that we have two waves of Jigungpa, one in 1191 and the second in 1208. But both authors rely on the Digung guide, which is almost from the 20th century. They take for granted the chapter 22 of Tsangnyon, and they also use Nyul Hanangpa and Jigten Gompo's Namtar, but they do not give really precise information regarding this matter. So the chronology is really unclear, but we can assume that the Kagyu masters arrived around the 13th century, which is a gap between the supposedly episode of Narubunchug and Milarepa taking possession of the site and the installation of the Kagyu masters. So, as a brief conclusion, we know though the episode is absent from almost every hagiography and life prayer concerning Milarepa. The episode is judged suspicious by Shicheripa. For this, you can look at Kristin's book; it's developed there, and the episode is ignored by the false Shamar. The story, as we know, at present appeared in the late 14th century. Sorry, it developed during the 15th century and culminated with Tsangnyon in 1488. We know Tsangnyon did not invent the story; he just transformed and redeveloped it. And we should wonder why this episode, if genuine, was not mentioned by the early Kagyu master as motivation for settling in Tissé. Since it's so well known and famous, they should say we ought to go to Tissé because it's a place won by Milarepa, but nobody talks about this. Also, the Miracle Cave is found in some pilgrimage guide and works about Tissé. So I guess it was initially an oral tradition connected to the site. It's only an hypothesis, and then it slowly grew and penetrated the Milarepa life story tradition to finally be fully developed by Tsangnyon, and it's also served as for legitimizing the narrative of the Kagyu presence in Tissé. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to both of you, and I hope you have many more interesting studies ahead and research and readings. And congratulations, Kristin, on your monumental book and getting it out. And it's not easy, I'm sure, all this cross literature, but very valuable work. So thank you for doing it. And thank you, Etienne.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
very much, Damian.
Thank you.
Thank you very much
Thank you.
for having us here.
Okay, thank you, everybody.